Hello, this is an extra to the main No Script show, and in particular to episode 3, where Nathan and I were doing our best to try and both understand and explain modern CSS layouts. And to do this, we were taking the main points of a talk by Rachel Andrew, who is perhaps best known to us for her contribution in bringing what I think is the first truly comprehensive layout spec for the web, CSS Grid, which was actually supported back in all the major browsers in 2017. So it shows how much we are catching up on. But as you can imagine, a talk like this, which gets into some of the technical aspects of it, doesn't suit too well an audio podcast format. So what I'm trying to do here is add a little bit of context by showing how the topics that she talked about have gone into informing the building of the show's website. And that is on purpose very simple and understyled, because we want to use it to demonstrate what we are learning as we go through the episode. So for example, not everyone likes an enforced dark mode. So by the time we get to user preferences, hopefully it'll be honoring your preferences. There'll be a light version here unless you've set your device or browser to dark. And hopefully there will also be a switch so you can switch between the two. Overall, this show is about us learning the fundamentals of designing for the browser at a time when the browsers have become very advanced, and also a time when designing for the web couldn't be more different to designing for print. We have generally looked back to print as the way to inform what we want to do on the web. And this has had its problems in the sense that it wasn't really ready for that, and it now is. But there was a sort of point where it got over complex to write your own sites, and you were losing some of the best parts of the web. The fact that whatever device you came on, you could see the content that you needed to. And if you couldn't see it at all, then you could still read the content. So we're kind of getting back to that. So I think even if you have no plans to author your own HTML and CSS, it's probably more essential now than ever to know the basics of what the code is doing, how the browser is dealing with that. And if you do know those basics, then also HTML and CSS become easy again. They were always designed to be easy declarative languages where you told the browser that already knew what to do. So it was always meant to be simple. Of course, there are lots of different levels to CSS. It's almost like lots of different languages. So it can be an advanced programming language, but it isn't really like JavaScript. So anyway, before I go on to mention the specific things that we were covering in episode 3, I thought I'd just make this video a little bit longer and talk to the people who might be where I was about a year ago. So back then, I decided that I should be able to offer some of my clients who have fairly simple sites, who don't need a CMS, I should be able to give them sites just using the web platform, as I once did back in sort of 2005 and 6. But I was overwhelmed with the new responsive web and what was coming to CSS. And I think that was largely down to probably following the wrong people. But now with a few sites under my belt, I see that I didn't need to overcomplicate things or to know it all. And that's kind of what I want to pass on here. But I also think it's a message that is there in Rachel Andrews' talk and other talks she's done since, as well as other people from the W3C, is that we probably need to look at CSS in an entirely different light than what we are used to. And she says in the Q&A to her talk that she's found it easier to teach people modern CSS who have no background in CSS before, not carrying that baggage. And I've also heard it said that she can teach people to build their own sites within a day, which to me would seem like a bit of a reach as I was coming into trying to do the same thing. But now I kind of see what she means with this, and hopefully I'll try and demonstrate that. But if you are interested in sort of following along with what we're doing and starting to make your own simple sites, I'll just quickly cover the tools. So, of course, for this podcast, we're putting aside the third-party platforms and frameworks, just concentrating on the web platform itself. So we needed a code editor, and I'm like almost everybody else who's making stuff on YouTube. I'm using Microsoft's VS Code, which is free to use and is open source and pretty powerful. But there is one thing to note on that. I'll carry on using that because I installed it, and there's lots of good videos on how to do that. But if you are concerned about the sort of privacy, the fact that even though it's open source, it still does connect up. So I think Microsoft gets some information about the sort of technology you're using. You might not want that. So there is a fork of that called VS Codium. So you might want to use that. It's the same thing, basically, without Microsoft being involved. Although I think this may be harder. You'll be on your own to install that, where you can probably find a good video for this. And I should probably just say as well, I mean, what we're doing is we are working to the W3C's rule of least power. So we start with HTML and CSS, these first easier declarative languages where the browser already knows and is equipped to do what we declare or want it to do. But we'll probably still need at some point a smidge of JavaScript. I mean, certainly if I want to switch for the light and dark mode at the moment, I will need to put in some JavaScript to do that. But even something like that is now coming to HTML and CSS. So what tends to happen here is that if you need to program it yourself, it gets to a point where the W3C says, well, this is so commonly used, most people need this, we should make it easier and put it into the declarative languages. So it comes out and there's no point in using the JavaScript, which is better because JavaScript it's not as fast and it generates more errors than the declarative languages. But anyway, what I wanted to get to here was the fact that even though I say we're starting very simple with this rule of least power, or keep it simple, stupid, which is what it's really saying, we are, in this case, making a site which is all about the content. Hopefully we'll keep going for some time, and we'll need some sort of content management system. So the chances are that at some point, fairly soon, we'll go back to using what we did use, and I still use for client sites, which is WordPress, and put that into a custom theme so we can just manage the content that we have. As you can imagine, if we wanted to change the header on our design and we've got all of these individual episodes, then it's going to be more difficult than it would be through a content management system. Or, and maybe as well, we might go and look at some of the new static site generators, Astro, and the one that I particularly are interested in because I like the person behind it and its philosophy, 11T. So we might do that. Anyway, let me move on. And yes, let's move on to hosting. So if you are wanting to do this, what we're using, and there are a few choices out there, but we're using Netlify because I've got some customers on that. And it's pretty much free for us because it has a very generous allowance, as many similar things do, of 100 gigabytes bandwidth per month. Now, given that none of the pages presently are over 50 kilobytes, we would have to be very, very popular before we need to pay. So I've put this on my account that have the 3 client sites on, and we're not even close to using, I think, 2 gigabytes per month on that. And you can go a more complex route with uploading to your host in here, but the simplest way is just to go to deploy here, and you can drag and drop the folder that you've made into there. And you don't need to bother with, if you don't need version control, you don't need GitHub, and that's fine. And it does this very quickly, and there's nothing to change, but it recognizes which files have changed and just makes the changes to those. And what I found is that this is sending to a global CDN, is wherever I am, within a second or two, the changes are there once I've done a refresh. So that's what we're using there. And the nice thing about starting this way is I did a speed test here, is that we're kind of giving Google what it was from the beginning, because the performance is going to be there because it's very simple HTML and CSS. I'm using just very simple semantic HTML, so the accessibility is there. We're not really needing to bother with ARIA labels, and I think the first rule of ARIA labels is don't use them if you don't need to. So we cover that with best practice, and I put the tags in for SEO. So it's nice to be able to start across the board with everything kind of ticked up like that. So what I'm going to do here is bring up VS Code, and I'll just talk a little bit about that. Again, for people who might have been in my situation where they either never touched HTML or CSS, or have done it so long ago as I did. And it was quite a big shift for me to go from a WYSIWYG editor to this. But actually, I prefer it now, being able to control the HTML. And the nice thing about it is that you get something like Emmet installed here, which is a bit of software which tries to think what you might need next. So you don't really do that much writing, and you've got lots of hints about what you might need to write next, which is quite useful. There are a couple of things you might need to install as extensions, live preview, so you can see things. And I've got an autocomplete tag if I wanted to change a div to a section or something. I've got lots of code. I just need to change the first one. The other one will automatically change. Okay, let me go to a page that doesn't exist on the actual site. This is the folder with all its contents. I'll put the live server on, and I'll just use this as a way to show how generally I've marked up the HTML here and how easy it is to use the code editor, and it'll lead me up to perhaps the first point that Rachel has in her talk. So all I need to do is to get my boilerplate starting point is to put in exclamation mark. I'm not good at typing and talking. I'm not good at typing at all. And it doesn't cover everything here, but I won't get into that. What I will do on this is I will just add in a link to a style sheet. We might as well use the one we're using. I need to put L in there, and I can see my options are there for the style sheet. And it's picked up because it puts in the right naming convention. And let's get into the body here. And to make it semantic, what I've been trying to do all the way, I mean, there's lots to talk about HTML because there's more to it than I know at the moment, but basic semantic markup gets you far. And we've got the tags of header, so we'll use that first, put in our header content, and it finds that pretty easy. I've put the nav inside the header, so nav, and I can put the tags in for that. I'd probably put on most things a main next for the main content. It might be an article, and if it's sectioned up into different things and those sections have titles, then I will call it a section rather than just call it a div, because that will make more sense, again, if there's a title with it. And the other thing is that generally I want to start with my headers in order so they're easy read. Sometimes that doesn't work out with the styling, which is the case on this site, but I want to make sure that the header 2 follows a header 1 and the header 3 follows a header 2, etc. So my new web page, just put this in, and quickly might as well just do this in to show that it's easy to get images. img gets me there, / to find my folder, which is up there of images, and if I go in here I can go and put in my logo. And it's pretty smart because it would know here that I'd want to put, to stop cumulative shift, I'd want to put in a fixed width and height. So even just doing that, but I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do in this case is, because I've got a class to go with this, I will just put CL and then enter, and then I can put in my class, which I know is logo. So we've got that. And let me just quickly put in a few paragraphs here. So P, and then I can put lorem ipsum with just LO. And what I'll need to do here, this works on Windows. If I go Alt and Z or Z, then everything can be seen here. It's not hiding away. I'll just copy a few more of these just to make the next point, which is really about flow, normal flow. And I think a lot of the talks, not just Rachel's, from people from the W3C, are about getting people to understand what the web gave us in the first place with simple HTML and even just in the browser CSS. It gave us a perfect system which would work on any size device where all the content would be available. So it's a series of boxes or blocks that stack vertically, and then in the blocks, the inline content here with the text will just wrap, so no one loses anything. And of course, when we as designers started to mess with this to make it more like print, we stuck fixed widths on the HTML element, and then suddenly devices that weren't the size that we had stuff off the page. They couldn't see the content properly. And as we get more complex and fixing those things up, we get all these sort of overflow issues. And that's really what the new modern web is trying to get back to this normal flow and the simplicity. And the new things, Flex and Grid, for our layouts are display properties which work within the normal flow still. They revert back to that always. And they're there really to stop overflow. We've got the new sizing, so it's flexible sizing with everything, so we can adjust the stuff. So we can kind of have our cake and eat it. But I think it's essential to understand the normal flow. And in a way, that's what I've tried to do. Normally, let me bring up the actual site. So I'll go to my index file, and I'll need my CSS, and I'll need to put the let's get there. We'll need to put the live preview on here. Okay, so when I've been doing the other sites, I've generally jumped ahead with grid, and I've put the headers in a grid and the footer and the main and all of that stuff. But what I decided to do here is, knowing that these talks would follow this thing, is to see how far normal flow, keeping it simple as possible, would take us with the design. Because remembering that most people now are viewing things on small devices where everything ends up stacking vertically anyway, we might want to ask the question, when do we need to expand that out into columns and make it a little bit more complex for ourselves? So we can get away, I think, a lot with that. And that's what we're doing here. I mean, a couple of things here. Obviously, it would all normally stack to the left. So there are a couple of things that we just go in there. I'll just quickly cover that. So in order to deal with that under my sections, so what I've done here is I've given, in this case on my main tag, I've given them an arrow, and we give it this kind of format for minimum, where we set it to characters that it can expand to. So that's really setting our minimum size here, and then 100% of the container minus 3 rems. And the auto here with the inline margin will then center this. And then on other pages, I wanted that to be wider, so I've just made that more characters on. In the case of the episodes, I wanted the content to go a bit wider. So I've set that just on the main. It could have been done in the body. But anyway, we can go a long way with pretty much normal flow. Let me go back to this page. The first place where we break it was the navigation. So to do that, the way that we break from our normal flow now is to use the other formats, which are all under the display property. And that's table and flex and grid. So I've used flex here, and if I go, and this was an unordered list that we're using here, and we're displaying it with flex. So if I just go and put nav in the search here, we'll see there's an unordered list, and on that I'm putting a display of flex. So all its children, the list items themselves, then get altered by this display flex, which automatically is set itself to display horizontally from what would be normally with list items would be a vertical display. It does that. It's also got justify content, so it's got the whole available space, because the restriction on the size is only there on my main. So the top header part is free and can be as wide as possible, but I've centered it over here. But if I take the center off here, we'll see that it goes to the flex defaults, which is where I can raise the other thing about logical properties. So they were started to be introduced when flex came out sometime, and this is the way where we go forward, where we stop talking about left, right, top and bottom, and start using logical properties of inline, which is what this is going, start, which would be left in a Western language, and end, which would be right. And that's because we now have writing modes where the web is aiming for internationalization, where it can support easily all other languages that don't flow the same as the West. And also it allows us to make our sites a little bit more international, because we can display things slightly different, or if we need to make a page which is the same design for another language, it makes it so much easier to translate to that. So when we come to our justify, this gets a little bit more difficult, where generally for Westerners, justifying means looking at the horizontal. So we're horizontally centering this, and a line of the contents, items or self will be about the positioning to the vertical positioning on it. But that is only true up to the point where we are in our Western language, and we are definitely using grid. When it comes to flex, there is an extra complexity in the sense that you can set it to columns and work that way. You can change the axis where that shifts about. But in all honesty, this is where I think I learned grid first, and we've got subgrid coming in, because it's really the comprehensive layout tool rather than flex. So you probably don't need to learn as much flex as is taught out there, because a lot of the things that people are teaching were to make up for the fact that we didn't have grid. So you can probably know less of flex, but it still has its own unique things that makes it useful. And in this case, it's very good for a menu when you might add new items, because by default, what it's trying to do with flex is be flexible. So it is letting the browser sort out what room you've got available for the content that you've put here, and it will be flexible to that. And I've put a wrap over here, so we get no overflow, it just wraps over here, but it adjusts to that. So that's kind of probably mostly where I'm kind of using Flex. Now, the other point where we break from the display, which is just normal flow, is with the host here, and then it goes into normal flow as we get to smaller devices. What I could have done here, I called this host, I think, let me go to there, is that I could have used Flex for this. It would work in the same way with just 2 items. If it's lots more, it stacks because it takes up the available space, where grid, you align it little grid areas. So when there's more items, depending on what you want, grid might be the one. I wouldn't necessarily need it for this, but I have chosen this because I knew also that grid would be wanted to be used for, let me just go to that now, the resources, where I've got multiple columns and this. And this great thing here where we go from 3 to 2 to 1, I mean, it would go to 4 if there was the space of it, and down there, or any number. And it just nicely lines up. It's all made possible with no media queries, with this really one line of code that we need to add with grid. And this is simply borrowed from, well, it's in a lot of places, but again, I'm using or referencing here the one a set of resources by Rachel Andrew. Let me just go over to them. So this is her explaining it here. It's often called the RAM technique, and it's over here. And it really is just this kind of one-liner that allows you to have this flexibility. So you can imagine just with this one trick, you can get away with a lot. Imagine, I mean, I'm only using a few little tricks, if you like, with this. As long as I understand what they're doing in the context they're in, there's a lot of designs I can do with simply knowing that. So there are a lot of these resources. I've linked to them in the show's episode. There is something else which takes this a lot further, by 2 people I really admire, Hayden Pickering and Andy Bell. And it's not entirely free. There are some free elements to it, but and maybe not as up to date now with a lot of the new stuff coming in, but it just gives simple, often Flexbox ways of dealing with the common layouts, just to simplify stuff. So you can kind of effectively copy and paste the work that they've done. And as they're saying, it's helped thousands of developers to simplify CSS layout in their project. So it's quite a good thing. I bought this, and it's probably not for the beginners. You probably might want to try some of the free stuff and play around with some stuff if that's what you're doing. Okay, I think that covers it. One exception to this is that I put a different, so this is all based on, we are effectively repeating the implicit grid. Once we've select grid, the grid is there for everywhere, and you don't specify where you want things to be on a grid. It's just there implicitly in the background. And if you say repeat, then you've got the content, it will fill those grids. And what we're saying is autofill those to a minimum of this size. So that gives you kind of sizing. It was setting pixels on Rachel's example, and then it will just fall to that. Where I wanted this to be bigger, because in the space that I've given for resources, I didn't want it to be going to the 3. I wanted to force it to go to just 2 with the space. So I changed that there. And what I did is I created the need for a media query to basically undo what I'd done. So if I take this off, you can see this. I set it to initial here on what we had. And I think I only needed to do this for displays which were about 320 pixels, which is only about 1% of people. They'll sort of get this horizontal scrolling, which I didn't want. So I had to do that. So I made it a little bit more complicated. If I'd have set with the 3, then I could have just used that one trick. Okay, there is one other trick I'll just mention in here, because it's a progressive enhancement. Largely, there's a lot of stuff coming out. Now, you can see here, it isn't working properly. This browser isn't doing what I wanted to do. I want this to line up beautifully with all of these. And what I've done is I've used Subgrid, which isn't supported by all the browsers. I think it is in Chrome. It's nearly all of them now, and it will be soon, which is a way of being able to section things up within the actual grid item itself. And let me just find you that. If I go to subgrid. So within my resources here, and also the episodes, my divs that I'm setting up for this, I've also put a subgrid on, and I got, again, this from Rachel Andrew. little progressive enhancement. If you put it into the rows here, I've set up 3, so this is a row, the content is a row, and this more to come is a row on here. And what it will do, and it's not doing it on this browser, is that it will, let me come away from this, we should see it working normally on Chrome. If I go to resources here, it is lining everything up there because I'm using that. So it's a progressive enhancement. But for me, learning grid made it a lot easier to understand a lot of the concepts we're talking about with alignment, and it's the overall layout thing. So that's the way I did it. I think that's probably all I wanted to cover. I did want to just mention about, and I couldn't cover this as a topic in the talk, about alignment. Sizing is probably the key thing to get your head around. The idea that we have these fractions where the browser decides the sort of space that you've got. It's the same as flex grow, which also decides it's not on your pixel value or some other value. So things are growing there, and we have minimum content and stuff. And we're using those sizing things, as you can see, with some of the min-max things that I set in there. But also the other thing is, as I tried to mention about the alignment issues, the best way to deal with it. Now, there isn't the space in this because you can only align things if there is the space for it. On the top, we have got the space. So I'm just going to go down and inspect. And the browser tools are great for this. If I can get it to select what I want to. Yeah, oops, it seems to want to select the other thing. But if I can get there, and I've got my flex here, then we've got all these things where we can play around. So justifying our content, we could have set this up to be different with a space around, space between, and all these other things. As long as there is the space to do it, and we can set our flex direction as well on this one. So it's great if you get lost with what is what, you can usually use the tools there. Hopefully, though, I haven't made this sound too complicated. I just want to say that you can go a long way with some very simple layout techniques. As long as you understand the logic behind it, you don't need to know the whole of the spec, and you can often use something, like Rachel's great resource there with lots of examples to kind of play around with stuff. What else did I want to mention? I think I've probably covered it all and talked enough. Yep, I have. So I think I'll get off. Sorry this was so long. I hope it was useful for someone, and I'll be doing much smaller videos to just show what we're doing as we build the site, but they should be a bit quicker. But if you want more in detail stuff on how I'm coding stuff up there, I'm quite happy to share. Of course, there will never be a masterclass from me. This is someone coming at it, trying to learn from the people who really do know their stuff, how to keep it as simple as possible. And that's how I'm approaching it. All right. I hope to see you again. Bye-bye.